Welcome to episode 32 of the Strategic Momentum Podcast. I'm your host, Connie Steele. Career growth is traditionally seen as a linear progression, but for the millennial generation, professional journeys are more commonly taking a non-linear or meandering path. For today's guest, Deepak Shukla, founder and CEO of the SEO agency Pearl Lemon, which is based in the UK, the meandering path was not just a byproduct of his curiosity, but an incubator for personal and professional growth. From art school to tax consulting to running his own recording studio, tutoring company, and now SEO agency, Deepak's habit of experimentation accelerated his skills development and helped him find his value and passion for marketing. Today, Deepak shares how to overcome the fear of the course, act on your impulses, and test and learn your way to career success. Let's hear his journey.
It's certainly been a journey. So I'm 32 years old right now, just recently. Happy birthday to me. And I, in 2008, graduated from Warwick University, where I was an art student. That transitioned or led me into something completely, obviously, left of field in becoming a tax consultant at Deloitte. So my journey started in the corporation. That was subsequent to a couple of different internships, one of them being at an ad agency called Media Edge. I ultimately went to Deloitte because, I don't know, I'm British Indian, so that's the thing to do, number one. Number two, people told me I could make the most money there. And kind of a variation of those things. Ultimately, that lasted several months before I realized that path wasn't quite the right one for me. I mean, I went on then to open up a recording studio, the graveyard of which people could find online with a little bit of searching, Deep Impact Recordings. So I pondered or delved into potentially becoming kind of a rapper and starting a career, and building a recording studio seemed the sensible thing to do. And since then, to be honest with you, Connie, what was I think really important at that time, I was 23, I think 25 when the studio itself finished. I think I began to recognize that I could pivot and that pivoting was a real thing, which was the interesting part. So since then, there's been different things that have happened. I raised money, just small sums like £5,000 and then £75,000 when I tried the second time around. Realized I wasn't going to be a tech co-founder, as was advertised in the media as being kind of the next great big thing that people should do if they weren't to pursue perhaps corporate career, which was the de facto thing to do whilst I was at Warwick at university. I ultimately recognized that the one thread that was consistent was that I wasn't half bad at marketing. I started the SEO agency in October of 2016. So when I turned 30, I started the same business that I run today, Pearl Lemon, which is, of course, the SEO agency that you made reference to. So yeah, if people were to look me up online, I am an SEO agency owner.
So tell me about how you realized that marketing is an area where you had significant strength, because certainly as a tax consultant at Deloitte, you weren't doing marketing.
Reinvention of my career has come a little bit naturally to me. And I think that, to be honest, Connie, it goes back to when I was 18 years old in hindsight. We spoke about those numbers where I met over, I don't know, like 1,000 people when I was 18 years old. And the crazy thing was when I was 18 in 2004, I think it was, that I went traveling. I didn't go with a mobile phone. The internet was obviously developed, but still, relatively speaking, in its nascent stages in respect of certainly my use of it. I didn't have a phone. I don't even recall having a Facebook account or anything of that ilk. So what it meant was that I could go and I could have the freedom to explore and experiment without really any consequence per se. And that was really interesting. I could go out and be quiet. I could go and be bubbly. I could talk about a particular thing that interested me. And from there, I think, and that continual exposure to different people really came, I think, the threads of realizing that, well, that's positioning, that's marketing, that's presentation. And that skill set, as I've moved from being an art student to going into tax to trying to become a rapper via the recording studios and then starting a tutoring agency and, the SEO agency that, of course, I run today has really been something that stuck with me, because what's at the bones of that is thinking, well, how is it that people perceive me? What is it that they want to hear to get the best impression of me firsthand? What is it that I can pick out from my resume or from an individual interaction that I've had, perhaps if it's not even on my resume, that will speak to their interests. And that was something I think that came as a consequence of meeting those people back when I was 18.
As you found that you were good in marketing, prior to that, you had even mentioned that you were, in special forces part of that. I think you also indicated you had really 29 jobs leading up to you realizing that you were good in marketing. Tell us a bit about that and this test and learn of all these different work experiences that made you realize, well, maybe I'm good in marketing.
Listen, Connie, I had 23 jobs by the time I was 25 or something ridiculous. I can't remember. I started first working when I was 14. I did a paper round, then that moved into working as an assistant at a local mechanics. I was underage, so they only paid me £2.50 per hour. And then I think one day I stopped turning up because I wasn't motivated to work 3 hours and earn £7.50, which is about $10. And I've had these kind of variety of kind of manual labor-ish different types of jobs. And I think that, as I got older and then I got into kind of more corporate jobs, as some of the kind of pivots happened and then I kind of got out of kind of grad school, in my journey of let's call it discovery or perhaps reinvention, one of the things that you quite rightly said is that before I started the agency, there was a bit of a kind of hiatus from careers, and that I'd done a decent job of the tutoring agency at around 26, 27, and then I decided that this isn't necessarily what I think is going to be my legacy. And I didn't know what was going to be my legacy. So what I had enjoyed through my 20s was a lot of endurance sport, the marathons, the ultra marathons. I tried an Ironman. I went out to Brazil to fight Thai kickboxing. And then the next great adventure, the challenge seemed to be, why don't I apply to the British Special Forces, as you made reference to. So ultimately, I did about 6 months of what was, well, no, actually, I tell a lie. I was involved for about a year as part of the training program. It wasn't a process that I ended up completing. I did withdraw, but along the way, a basically trained British soldier. You go away on some weekends with kind of special forces operators, and that was definitely a wild ride. And yeah, Connie, it's always a difficult question to answer, particularly for me when people ask, what's your kind of career history been like? But I think that the Steve Jobs video really, it really is true that sometimes you discover over time that the dots can really connect. And, the biggest thing that, I kind of figured out when I was younger is that I am the one that's getting in the way of myself. And actually, there's never been any issue with any of my repurposing. There hasn't been one moment where anybody has called me a fraud for perhaps presenting myself as being a tutor or being a digital marketer or being an SEO guy or being a tax consultant. It's often been fear, of course, that has stopped many of us, including myself in some spaces, from actually taking the action. Because when you discover what's on the other side, it's 95% of the time a lot less worse than you think it will be.
Oh, that's very true. So what's interesting is that you talk about this need to define your legacy. So which is probably tied in with the need to define purpose, because I know that is pretty critical for many people these days, particularly millennials, but I think also those that are older. Do you think that was a critical factor in the journey and pivoting and trying and testing and learning through these different career opportunities that you had?
Connie, 100%. What springs to mind is Jack Ma's speech, the founder of Alibaba. There's quite a powerful video clip that I watched on YouTube where he talks about his journey to success. And I think he started Alibaba when he was 33, when he had little to no kind of coding knowledge. And, Alibaba, I think a couple of times the size of Amazon. I'm not quite sure, but he talks about, in your 20s, don't necessarily worry as much about your legacy, but instead gain experiences and find mentors. And then in your 30s, find something that you think, you can build and grow from. And I watched that video when I was probably 29. No, actually, I watched it less than a year ago, in fact. And I definitely say that, I was, and I still am to a degree, trying to figure things out. And when I say figure things out, figuring out what I was good at, what things were like, because there's just this whole case of you don't know what you don't know. I don't like living vicariously. I don't want to look at other people's experiences of things and let that taint my own experience of it before I've even tried things. And I think that other people's negative experiences sometimes limit us. So definitely for me, exploration was huge, because I just felt it made sense to find out what is going to be my higher calling comes as a consequence of trying lots of different things, because again, you don't know what you don't know. And I think that was a lot about what my 20s were for. And that's part of the reason that, I withdrew my application from, the Special Forces, because I kind of sat down one day and I thought, and it was near to my 30th birthday, I think, what the hell am I doing? Like, why am I here? Why am I doing this? I don't want to be here. I'm not particularly enjoying the process. And I think that reminds me of another quote, which comes from Tony Robbins, which he says that, change often comes when the fear of remaining the same becomes greater than the pain of change. And certainly, at those times where I felt that, okay, this is interesting, but it doesn't really align with perhaps necessarily what my vision is or what my value is. So therefore, I need to continue searching. And I think sometimes also the problem is that people feel they need to wait for an articulation of what that vision is. You don't know when that will come. Again, that can come when you're 49 years old and you're sitting in front of a dinner table, or, for Mark Zuckerberg, it came when he was 19 and he coded Facebook. Sometimes things are thrust upon you. Sometimes you stumble upon them. And I think that, there's also a little bit of fearfulness because of what people might say. And also a sense of, well, I need to wait to kind of discover it. And people try and seek out discovery through reading books. And that only works for me up to a point. It's like, dude, you don't know what running a marathon is like by reading a book. So how can you therefore decide that running's not for you? It just doesn't make sense. And I think that if you try and road test life by getting in the vehicle instead of reading the book, for me, I felt that it's bringing me a lot closer to figuring out kind of what, my superpower and what my value to the world can truly become.
Fear of the course is often the main inhibitor to career growth. Whether it's fear of uncertainty or fear of failure, this can pose a threat to road testing life firsthand and taking risks that ultimately help you understand your true value. The key, as Deepak will explain, is to leverage your fear as motivation by attaching a negative consequence to not taking that risk. For those now who are in their early mid-stage career like you've been, what other things do you feel get in the way of being able to find that right career path, which may or may not be conventional? You certainly talked about some of them, which is the need to feel like you have to have an answer to things, which may not ever come. But what else do you feel really inhibits people from probably just trying?
For me, one of the big things that changed is recognizing that, people more often than not will and sometimes often and unwittingly so, people kind of collude in your limitations. So you'll say, oh, I'm not sure about that. And people, even simple things such as somebody saying, I understand, kind of reinforces kind of, your desire to remain in a safe space. So one of the things that, I became kind of cognizant to is that when we express fears of failure, anyone attaching any confirmation to that, it's actually attaching energy to something that's going to inhibit you. So that whole thing about changing your inputs, and inputs literally can be a phrase, inputs can be music, inputs can be friends. So one of the things that, really helped me is I often, at a time where I think that something's not quite right, I change things as literally as the music playlist that I listen to, of course, being more mindful of the things that people say to me and people, I say to others. And one of the things that have been really pivotal for me also is adding a level of accountability. But people hear about this kind of accountability stuff, and it's like, okay, but there needs to be, for me, there's been negative repercussions to not living up to your own actions. Not. People don't chase reward; they run from the risk of failure. They run from punishment, and that's what we need to kind of use as leverage, because it's our mammalian brains, of course, that are a lot more well developed. This whole kind of cognition and these conversations we have, that's kind of the surface. If you unpack that, there's just kind of lots of basal instincts. And if you activate the fear, but in a way that supports your growth, then brilliant. So, that began for me when I was, I think, 19 years old. I remember I went to a self-development conference and I ended up booking a marathon, my first ever marathon, to Chicago on my credit card. I didn't have the money, and Chicago is a ridiculous place to go to when you're, I beg your pardon, when I was like 21, 22, I could have done a marathon down the road from where I live in London. Why did I book Chicago? Why did I book it on my credit card? Why did I book the flights? Because I knew I needed to pay that money back. I knew that it would instill change. I knew that there was, a repercussion to doing those things. And, that can come in any form, whether that's someone who can hold you accountable and there's punishments to it. But for me, that has been also a big driver, because then you get a wake-up call when you recognize that, well, I said this and I attached a negative incentive. If I don't do this, Frank, I have to send you £150. That makes the necessity for action huge. And that has helped me a lot at those points where I feel that, I need to, or something's not right here. I tell everybody about it, and then I attach negative incentives to it. And that has got me out of some, situations where I felt that certainly within my career, I wasn't working towards perhaps my highest value.
What seems interesting for you in your career journey is that it's been a lot about risk taking. You've embraced risk taking, which seems counter to probably most people, but probably something that's a bit more pervasive now, or there's maybe a openness to experiment and try. But why do you think there is still that prevailing perception out there that managing your career is about managing risk potentially?
I think it's pervasive because, it's inherently hard because of, the fear of failure that we all have, that's probably built on an evolutionary basis. I think that, trying to reframe it and recognize today that career reinvention or repositioning has become so important is hard. And, the reason it becomes so important is because, job stability, if you will, is, what does that mean? Does that mean a regular paycheck? Does that mean a regular paycheck in the same position for the rest of your life because you've hit a glass ceiling? Does that mean that, that you've hit a glass ceiling because either you're not good enough or the company's not growing fast enough? So I think that, going through that process is just very, very difficult. And, for a lot of the time, it depends upon the kind of leaps that you want to take. And I think that because that fearfulness is so well developed in us, and that pain of loss, that we kind of want to label, this is risk, and let's manage it by bottling it into a kind of cupboard and thinking about, okay, well, what can we do to safeguard our career and yet grow, for example, at the same time? And one of the things that has always struck with me, and this again relates to ambition, that ambition and risk are intertwined, because if you want to go to places you've not yet been, you have to do things that you've not yet done. And that has been powerful for me to recognize that, well, if I want to skip ahead of the queue, I can't rely upon the advice of the people around me because none of them have done that. So I need to look for kind of outside opportunities, and that can be a way to shortcut your progress. So I think that, that whole process is just difficult, and it does come with a lot more failures than it does with victories oftentimes. And when I began to become cognizant to that, I was like, wow, I'm really getting advice in an illogical way. So all the people that I seek advice from, that they haven't really done what I want to do, and they've not made the leaps in their career. They've done it in the traditional way. And if that's okay and what people want to do, then that's brilliant. But in this day and age, I think that, it's better to have tried at least some elements of both. All of those reasons, I think, just largely speaking, make it a lot more difficult than perhaps to just kind of go with the flow.
What I heard from that is that, you may each have had the same end goal. So the person that you're getting advice from, and you may have sort of that end goal in mind, but the way to get there is fundamentally different, because whether it's the length of time or the approach or the experiences that you want versus what that person had been through may not necessarily align. So following in somebody else's shoes really could inhibit you from achieving the goal in the way that you want to.
Absolutely. 100%. To the same degree that a 6'1", blonde hair, blue eyed male taking career advice about how he should follow his path from, let's say, a 5'1" female who is of Eastern Asian origin, who's in a role that he wants, their paths are going to be so diluted by people's perceptions of them and therefore the way that they engage in the work environment. So people should recognize some of these things and really try and think about, well, who am I taking advice from? Have they done what I want to do? And there's elements that you can, of course, draw from it. It's not to dismiss any of that, but it's just recognizing if you want to get to places that you've not yet been, you have to try new things. And that also includes where you get your advice from.
In following career advice, context is key. It's not only about looking at what you've done, but also the various factors that can influence your path of success. You have to try new things, which include where you get your advice from. Go outside of your workplace, your industry, your network, and seek advice and inspiration from sources that align not only with your goals, but also how you want to achieve them. Otherwise, you risk stagnation. You can't create your own path by following someone else's. Deepak believes that the broad experiences that one can have can ultimately come back and make you more productive, efficient, and potentially more creative in whatever you choose to pursue. Yet it's important to create anchors along your path to keep your momentum moving in the right direction. So Deepak, why do folks feel that this notion of taking a meandering path, for example, isn't always additive and beneficial? And do you think society may unfairly penalize folks for taking a non-linear or non-conventional route to their career?
Yes, the short answer is broadly that I think there is a level of penalization for it. Why? Because, institutions, of course, move slower than technological change. So everything is happening a little bit, in slow motion, in the same way that, any academic textbook that's published about marketing is outdated by the time any student ever reads it, because you just need to go to the latest blog post from a new case study. So if you follow that route, it just does stand to reason that the old guard are struggling to understand the path of kind of the new trailblazers. So there's always, I think that probably paradigm exists in across industry. I think it's just a natural consequence of evolution, I think. And, it does mean correspondingly, I think, that some of the old ways die out, and some of the old ways do die out because, and this is where the benefit of a meandering career path comes in, is that the dividing lines are all being blurred. People's skill sets are ever broadening, one, because of the tools that you get access to online, two, because of the inputs that you can get, of course, online, and then three, just just small practical things like I can fly halfway around the world for a couple of $100 now. Everything has changed. Everything has changed.
What else do you think it really takes to break through that inertia? Inertia meaning ultimately trying to find that right career path for you.
It's about doing anything that borders or journeys into your stretch zone, and there's any version of that. I definitely, don't want to communicate the idea that, well, Deepak, I'm not going to just quit my job and go and then try and do this and try and do that. That's not the message I want to communicate. But what you can do to then, find your value, and you can begin some of the more practical elements of the journey that might be scary, and an example of this being, when I was at Deloitte, one of the first books that I bought was How to Think Like a CEO, because I just thought it made sense to look at a book that can guide me as to the politics of the career workplace, because that was not an education that I'd been given by any of the training that I'd received at Deloitte. It was all technical, and then you learn soft skills, but you don't learn formally. So that was something that was powerful. And, from that, I learned about, become the Excel master in the office. Because if you're the guy that can do VBA lookups and all of these crazy functions, you will get in the room when it comes to some of the more important stuff. That was number one. Number two, I learned that when someone gives you a project, find out from somebody else how they like to receive their project. Do they like their lines end stopped? Do they like italics or underlines? Do they like, you learn all of these small things that ultimately can help you get into people's good books. And that's just one practical example of how people can start doing things they've not yet done. And in the process of doing that, you will learn new things. You will get access to new opportunities. And, a journey or a new door may reveal itself to you that didn't previously exist because you stuck your head above the parapet in quite a structured still, but quite a new but still safe way. So I think that, for those who are suffering inertia or analysis paralysis or kind of sitting on the fence, something as small as that would, I think, fall into kind of the remit of, okay, great, that can give you a new kind of code that you can apply to the workplace to see what kind of return that you get.
Is it really about starting small, trying something that really does get you out of your comfort zone to see if it's a skill or an experience that sticks and may align to something you're good at?
I think, I want them to try something absolutely massive, but this is going on the basis that there's an element of realistic expectations. I believe you need to create anchors. So anchoring yourself to something that's going to hold you to a higher standard, and the higher standard needs to be, the higher standard should be in something that will guide you towards, whether that's your higher value or just guide you in the direction of growth. And growth can take any form. The only idea is that it doesn't follow something repetitive. So if you make sure that your, assignment for works or your projects are, typically finished a day ahead of time, even finishing it a day ahead of time or 2 days wouldn't necessarily count as growth. I think that this process is something that isn't linear. It needs to be something that's a little bit more lateral. So kind of looking at what you can achieve sideways to then really, take big leaps forward. And that can be however big or small that you choose it to be, but it needs to be measurable, something that you can kind of show to the world. Because if it's hidden indoors, it typically means that, there's some level of either internal or external collusion that's happening that will ultimately keep you in the seat that you're in. I think that, that has been helpful to me, certainly, as I've kept trying to change. And then the process of change just began to become so natural to me. But I recognize that wasn't how I started my journey.
When you talked about creating anchors, what were your anchors for growth?
My internal anchors are acting upon my impulsive moments. That has helped me far more than it's harmed me. An example of impulsive moments like, I'm really not enjoying being a tax consultant at Deloitte. And I immediately told about 4 people on the internship program about it, on the graduate program. That created momentum that helped support the reality of that feeling, because it kind of existed for a little while, but there came an impulsive moment, rather, should I say, that it got built up to, like, the gas cooker, if you will, where my lid blew and I was just frustrated. So I took advantage of that. And that in various forms has happened many a time. When I was at NatWest Bank, when I was 18, working as a teller, as I said, behind the till, I remember my mum was always worried at that time. That was before I went to university, that I'd get a job and I'd maybe get a car and get in a relationship and not go back to education. That I had saved up enough money to buy a car, but on my lunch break, rather than, I thought, it'd be good to travel. And then on my lunch break, I literally called and booked a 6-month trip around the world. I think that practically when you have those moments, like now, if someone comes off this podcast feeling like, wow, motivated, do something that you can't back out of. Because then the momentum will follow. The momentum should carry you further forward.
What I'm hearing is that when you have this impulsive moment, it sounds like it's all about not overthinking it and taking action.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not about the result that action creates. It's about the future actions that you will take that will be in line with your goals, and that you'll begin to fight fearfulness more. So, going to travel was neither here nor there. It was the mere act of doing something that was, outside of my comfort zone. And then you begin to take decisions more intelligently, I think. Then it's like, oh, wow, there's that personal development course that rationally it makes sense that I should take that. Or there's that, night accounting course because I want to get my ACCA qualification or whatever it may be. And then you begin acting in ways that support you, but it begins with that just sticky, that uncomfortable process of booking something that you're a bit worried about. And I attach money to it. I use the word booking because, money is a great motivator. And when you book something, it's like, wow, I pay for something, I'm invested. Okay, I've got to go with it.
That's great. So given that you have a penchant for going out of your comfort zone, what's next for you?
Great question. On the career front, I've just embarked upon my first formal course launch. That looks like it may overtake the SEO agency in terms of growth. Ironically, the course is about how to build an agency, which is of course what I've been doing for the last 2 years. So that's got off to a fabulous start. And then personally, I just finished my last series of endurance events, and I'm still thinking about exploring combat sports again. I had one fight with Thai kickboxing I made reference to, and there's a gym across the road for me. So I'm still experimenting with the idea of going there again and getting back on that journey. So they're probably the two big things that I'm thinking about. I've already started in some way exploring at the moment.
So any other recommendations or words of wisdom?
I'm an art student. One of the things that was really good for me, guys, was books. When I decided to make any transition, I would immediately Google, or Amazon in this case, the top 10 bestsellers, and I would buy all of those books and I would read all of them. And then I would just journey into that world once I'd gained a significant amount of knowledge. So I think that, if you're thinking about doing something that you've not yet done, go out and get the data, read it in an aggressive fashion, acquire all of the knowledge that you think is relevant to making that move, and then go out and do it.
Awesome. And finally, what's the best way listeners can connect with you?
Guys, Google me, Deepak Shukla, deepakshukla.com. I'm sure Connie's probably put it in some notes or some link somewhere. Just go to my website, deepakshukla.com. You'll read about my adventures, my personal life, as well as, of course, the SEO stuff, and you can consume whatever you wish to.
Thanks. Great insight, Deepak, and really to sort of this changing face of career growth. And it's obviously not a linear path anymore. So thank you so much for being on the show.
Oh, Connie, thank you. I had a really good time being here with you.
For the millennial generation, there's a desire to find a higher purpose, which comes from ongoing exploration and experimentation. But with the fears of risk and failure, coupled with the pressure from society to conform to an existing structure, there's a tension that's in conflict with what they want to do. But as Deepak tells us, it's actually okay to act on your impulses. But you got to create those anchors along the way to hold you accountable for staying on track towards your ultimate goals. And open up yourself to other sources of advice that may have been different from where you've traditionally received it. Do your own research and experimentation to create your unique path. Thanks for listening to the Strategic Momentum Podcast. You can connect with Deepak through his website at deepakshukla.com. That's a DeepakShukla.com. And if you've liked what you heard, please subscribe to the show on iTunes and leave us a review. This is what helps others find the podcast. You can also find us on Google Podcasts, Spotify, and Stitcher Radio. And if you want to hear previous episodes or get show notes from this episode, you can also visit us on our podcast page at flywheelassociates.com/podcast. I'm Connie Steele, and you've been listening to the Strategic Momentum Podcast.